Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 3rd of July, and in today's video, we're looking at a lot of frontline developments. We're going to begin with Kamyansk in Zaporizhzhia because we now have the Russians crossing over the local body of water. We're also going to once again look at southern Donetsk. We have some important updates through some of the open fields over there. We're also going to discuss and do a recap of some of the recent events that have been unfolding in Sumy Oblast because I know I've not been talking about it enough. So we're going to do the topic justice today. We're also going to look at the temporary halt of some weapon systems by the United States. This initiative was undertaken by the Undersecretary for Defense Policy in the United States, Albert Colby. He paused those shipments, and now that's causing a lot of diplomatic, discussions. And a meeting, a phone call is actually supposed to occur between Trump and Zelensky tomorrow. So we're going to get into the details of that story in the end of today's video. And I also did adjust some of the unit locations after just going through the evidence based on publicly available footage. And I was able to recalibrate the locations for a lot of these brigades and battalions. So we're going to go through the unit compositions along the critical parts of the front line. And we're actually going to begin by doing that in Zaporizhzhia once I finish looking at the actual advances. So with these yellow polygons, you can see these are the Russian pushes forward over the past 48 hours. There are two videos that give us this indication that the Russians have been able to cross over the Antracrack River. The first one is from over here from July 2nd. It's a video from the 247th Air Assault Regiment, and they've been the main unit involved in these ground assaults, especially the 2nd Battalion of the unit. So they tried clearing a house, that individual soldier that tried to approach a house, in particular the entrance to the basement, but they were unable to get in and eliminate the Ukrainians. It may be plural that were inside the house. And then at some point, he retreated a couple of meters away from the house, and then there was a barrage of FPV strikes onto the building. And this shows us that the Russian forces are already engaged in clearing operations. And if they've cleared this house or are trying to, it does imply that there aren't necessarily Ukrainian forces in the houses south of it, and that those ones may have already been cleared by the Russian forces. And this does indicate that the Russians have been able to push 800 meters northwards, which in the grand scheme of things doesn't appear to be much within the context of this one particular village, though, which we know has been under back and forth fighting for 2.5 years now. It actually is proportionally a lot when you're looking at a village that spans 3.5 kilometers. So this was one advance, and it amounted to 0.8 square kilometers in territory. And then the other one, a bit further westwards, amounted to nearly 2 square kilometers of territory captured. So this is a region that is a bit less dense when it comes to the location of the houses. They're sort of spread out, and you do have this sort of interfluve that's located just north of the river, and this wider portion that sort of feeds into the Dnipro River. So the Russian forces, I believe they probably did cross over from this sort of eastern direction, east of the advanced location that's marked in yellow, I believe. I don't really think they came through the narrow portion of land, the sort of strip that connects between the northern and southern banks of the river. So they advanced likely along the highway and then branched off from there. So you have these two concurrent advances, meaning that the Ukrainians still have their forwardmost positions located in the center. And that's probably where they had the most density in terms of forces, which is understandable because that's where the highway is actually located. And you do have this sort of dense district, which sort of acts as a village within a village, which still remains under Ukrainian control. So it's certainly not the end of the village for the Ukrainian side. They have units here, actually multiple notable units, including the Kraken Special Operations Detachment. So they haven't really been that active across much of the front line in recent years. We know they played a huge role in 2022, 2023 during a lot of engagements, including Ukrainian offensive activities. They've gone through a lot of renovations, a lot of replenishment phases, and a lot of new recruits coming in recently. So they've been in this sort of volunteer phase where they're getting a lot of new forces and building up the unit again. So they are currently deployed to this region, but the main defensive effort is coming from the 241st Territorial Defense Brigade. And we can all recall that they were previously stationed northeast of Pokrovsk, but at some point, maybe it was a month ago or something like that, they were redeployed to this part of the front line. And there are a couple of other units that are not full brigade-sized forces. They're just individual elements like National Guard detachments and there may be some additional battalions that are just independent and floating around here. But it is still a notable density for such a narrow part of the front line, and it goes both ways. Before we get into that, though, you also have the 15th Battalion of 128th Brigade, which is one of these prominent units that is stationed really across the entire line in Zaporizhzhia from Kamyanske, likely to the Kharkiv sector further eastwards. At the same time, the Russian forces they have in this region, the 247th Air Assault Regiment, which is a notable addition to the collection of forces over here. Although they were previously located a bit further eastwards around Kharkiv, now they are involved in the offensive activities westwards. And I believe that this was an advance of opportunity. I don't think that they really were trying to push over here to a similar degree that we see across three other critical parts of the front line, where we actually do have directives from the Russian side to achieve certain operational goals on a daily basis. So that would include the southern Donetsk front directly, south of the border between Donetsk and Dnipro. It would also include the Pokrovsk front, where we're seeing a lot of recent advances. I talked about it in my last video, and also the Sumy front. Those are the three areas where we're seeing the highest intensity of Russian advances. And actually, throughout the month of June, 76% of the territory captured by the Russian side occurred along those three parts of the front line. So only 24% for the rest of the front line, which would probably account for like 80% of the rest of the line of contact, maybe 70% if we're being generous. But just to zoom in over here and get back to the point of this section over here, we do still have some pockets of Ukrainian resistance, but the Russian side being able to cross over the body of water sort of cements their presence deep into the village and allows them to build up their forces, whether it be from the 247th or from the 4th Military Base Battalion or from the 19th Motor Rifle Division and its various subsidiaries that are located over here. So all of that has to be kept in mind, and it's a part of the Russians taking advantage of opportunities because, there are lower caliber units now. 241st is not of the highest caliber. I know they did conduct some successful operations in Kharkiv last year, so they do have a certain degree of experience, but they, at the end of the day, are territorial defense units, and the rest of the units over here are not necessarily going to be full-fledged brigades. They're battalion size or even less in many cases. So there is an issue with the quality over here, which did give the Russians an opportunity to see where there can be exploitations of the line, where they can break through, where the Ukrainians were a bit thin, and that's just the area where they seized the moment through and were able to achieve that advance. But just to get the bigger picture over here, we can see that the Russians are still about 25 to 26 kilometers away from reaching the southern outskirts of Zaporizhzhia. And more generally, when you look at the objectives, it would be to eventually overrun the Ukrainian layers of defense over here. We know there are many layers, and the one area where there's a lack of coverage would be basically the area right next to the coast. And the way in which the Ukrainians compensate for this would be the actual villages that are running along the eastern bank of the river and having troops deployed over there. And so that's a vector through which the Russians can sort of avoid and circumvent some of the most dense defenses that you have built up in areas that are a bit further inland, that are defending areas like Komushiovacha over here, and it makes it extremely difficult to conduct head-on attacks towards those areas. So the advance along the highway does become important as a result. But all in all, I do believe that it is just sort of an opportunity that the Russians decided to take. And now, as we zoom in, I want to look at advances on the southern Donetsk front. So we can see that there are three specific areas where the Russians were able to achieve further advances. First of all, just to the west of the Mokryali River, we now have consolidation of this pocket that had formed due to the Russian forces doing this sort of maneuver, two-pronged attack. From one direction, they expanded out of Fedorivka, and then from the other, they pushed from the south and were able to get rid of the Ukrainian salient, rendering it really difficult to remain in those positions. And by virtue of these concurrent attacks, they were able to isolate the Ukrainian squads that are sandwiched in between two lines of defense. You have the trenches that are marked over here in yellow, and then the network of defenses that is built just a couple hundred meters northwards. So all the hinterlands in between have now been seized by the Russian side, which will lead to a correction on the front line, meaning that the Russian forces will have this more cohesive line of contact through which to push towards their next desired targets. And I do believe that there are two notable targets over here. First of all, they would like to further cut off the road leading into Voskresenko. Voskresenko acting as the forward buffer between the line of contact and the border with Dnipro along another location, yet another location where the Russians can infiltrate the border, and also the trenches over there, because that's another important piece of this. It's not just about the sort of arbitrary border, but it's more so about the actual defenses built around it that have to be overrun. And then from there, you reach villages like Sikhneve and Malivka. So that's a target for the Russian side, and it's one of the larger villages that still remains close to the front lines. Then advancing northwards towards Mirny, that's another important goal. The Russian forces are looking at an advance from the north. They've just crossed over the Mokreli River for the first time, and they want to in tandem attack from the south. That will create the necessary pressure to force out the Ukrainians from the remnants of this salient over here east of the river, which is not centered around any sort of open field of the sort. It's, or rather, any sort of populated area. It's just completely open field, some tree lines, barely any fortifications that were well prepared. So it's a goal of the Russians to force out all of the small Ukrainian groupings that are just trying to buy time, further solidify a buffer zone, to buy a couple more days for Mirny Pidubny. They want to just completely get rid of this thorn in their backside, and by extension also capture Perbudova. And they also want to, in the same vein, capture Mirny and Pidubny, and that could definitely be done by advancing from the south further northwards, and couple that with the current vector that's expanding out of Zerko. That sort of advance would give the Russians the necessary amount of momentum to just completely overrun the line west of the river, which includes areas like Hrushivske, which again is so small in size. And we've talked about this numerous times now, that the Russians have a track record along this part of the front line, whether it be from the 114th Motorized Rifle Brigade or the 36th Brigade, to launch these attacks either on foot, or if it's an extended distance away, several kilometers perhaps, using light forms of vehicles like motorcycles, ATVs, buggies. All those are sort of light vehicles needed to really quickly arrive at the entrance to a village through the main road, then seep themselves into the initial basements. Couple that with a drone attack, largely from nearby FPV crews from the nearest settlement, to force the Ukrainians to either move out or dig into the basements. And then that gives the Russians the opportunity to take over all of the locations that are above ground. And then from there to clear out the individual houses. And when that sort of assault that is well coordinated with the local artillery crews, which are continuing to move forward and further westwards as we move on, and a lot of that can actually be very beneficial for these, closer range howitzers, if they're going to be set up along key ridges. And a lot of those ridges have now fallen into Russian hands due to the fall of Odradny and Bakhatir, for instance. So, with all that being said, it makes it extremely difficult for the Ukrainians in an isolated hamlet that is sort of disconnected from other key, rear bases, to defend there for a long period of time. And that's the sort of model that we saw with Zaporizhzhia, Yalta, Zerko. But then, you could give the Ukrainians the benefit of the doubt and say that it's on the wrong side of the river. But we've already seen how the Russians have crossed over that river. And so the next litmus test will be how long the Ukrainians can resist in villages like Kharkiv. They were just so small in size. And same thing with Tolstoy. And then northwards, areas like Novokhatske, Zeleny High, because those areas already give the Russians access not just to the border, but also to key locations on the border like Ivanivka and Havrilivka. And those are the rear bases that I'm talking about, areas that used to act as forward, rear bases and artillery battery locations. But at this point, I believe that they're going to start being moved backwards because it's getting dangerously close to the front line. But they are areas that would be easy to defend, like in the sense that, taking over these mid-sized towns is certainly difficult, especially with the river. But the Ukrainians would prefer that they continue to act as a rear base, not necessarily as a frontline village. They want to ensure that the fighting remains sort of southeastwards of those locations, that it doesn't move forward into Dnipro Oblast itself. But if that becomes necessary, if there isn't any other choice, then those villages actually are areas that would be suitable for defense. But then again, they don't want to lose any of those mid-sized settlements anymore. So you look at the advance over here, south of Zerka, it amounts to 1.8 square kilometers of territory. and it gives the Russians an opportunity to reach Pidubny. So the 37th Marine Brigade, they released footage from this area. They claimed that they killed 55 Russian soldiers and wounded 31 between the 28th and 30th of June, and that would be a 3-day period in which they were able to inflict those casualties. And the video showed, like, I don't know, 10 casualties, maybe 15, I don't remember, and it's all in these open fields that were basically used as the routes to arrive from the bases, the forward operating bases, the nodes in Andrivka, Konstantinopil, Bakhatir, and then they have to really take this really long trek westwards to arrive at a lot of contact. And so, by nature of that sort of open geography, it makes them much more susceptible, the Russian forces, to those FPV strikes or grenade drops, especially when they're not relying on armored assets anymore. They're either going on foot or using motorcycles. It makes it much more easy for drone crews to pick them off. So that's why we see all that footage. When it comes to the open fields that are just northwest of Andrivka, a lot of them have now fallen into Russian hands per Deep State themselves. So for a long time, there was a lot of ambiguity about the trenches that are sort of hovering around Andrivka, including to the west and to the northwest of the town. But now, for the most part, they've been captured by the Russian side. The remaining trenches are just north of Oleksivka and Zeleny Kuts and also Novoukrainka. But all of the ambiguity surrounding the floodplains near the Vovch River has sort of dissipated. The Russians have taken it all over, and the process also took over a large chunk of the open field salient that was sandwiched in between the highway over here in yellow and Bogdanivka. So the advance amounted to nearly 18 square kilometers of territory. That is a large amount, and it didn't happen in one fell swoop. It's just the culmination of several days worth of advances being reported at once. And if we are to measure it, we can see that the advance amounts to, what is this, 5+ kilometers westwards. If we look at the distance between the current front line and the border with Dnipro, it amounts to something like 6.5 kilometers. So nearly halfway to the border. And this wouldn't just be a pointed advance, it would be a broad advance across an extended line from the Vovcha River, from Novoukrainka, all the way up to an area like Horikove. And that could amount to, what is this, 8-9 kilometers. So it is a significant amount. And that would give the Russian forces a broad front in numerous directions and vectors of attack to choose from to initiate their attack on Novopavlivka. And of course, the desired attack route will be through a highway that's reliable for armored breakthrough. And I do believe that in order to overrun Novopavlivka, they can't rely just on these light vehicles. They need to actually utilize whatever stockpiles they have over here of tanks to lead the column, in addition to many MTLBs and BMPs. So the perfect area to do that would be through these open fields. And there aren't that many trenches along the southeastern flank. So reaching that sort of southeastern location through the border and then pushing, I believe, what is it, like 9 kilometers northwestwards, that is certainly a feasible tactic that the Russians can employ. And it would sort of circumvent the sort of trenches that were built directly south that are running horizontally, trying to defend against these vertical attacks coming from south. And in the process, also Horikova and all of the Ukrainian resistance that is, largely being led by the 72nd Brigade would be rendered superfluous and taken over. So over here, just to the north of Novostrohivka, we have another advance. It amounts to 1.5 square kilometers of territory. And this just further solidifies Russian control near the border area. It's just further open fields, this local warehouse. But I'm going to continue keeping my eye out for the Russians actually deciding and initiating an attack on the border region itself, including on this really important height, or actually not height, but obstacle. It's this sort of fortress that is shaped in a formation that's very conducive for repelling assaults, absorbing attacks from offensive sides. So it's going to be interesting to see whether the Ukrainians are able to man it efficiently, despite the fact that it is located pretty far away from larger Ukrainian garrisons. I would say the closest one is Novopidorodny over here, and it is a dangerous location for the 59th Brigade to be situated in, which is, the main unit involved over here. And so I'll be looking out for a Russian attempt to overrun those trenches and the anti-tank ditches as well. So moving on to the front line, I believe not around Pokrovsk because we don't have many updates from here. Although I would just say that I have reshuffled the troop deployments over here following additional evidence. And what I would note is that you do have a large cluster of Marine brigades. So generally, the quality is improved over here. You have a lot of higher caliber units, and that's completely understandable because it's a way to compensate, frankly, for the lack of trenches that were built in this area that's recently fallen into Russian hands. This region that amounts to like 50 square kilometers, maybe even more, in between the T0504 highway and the current line of contact, which is actually sort of based around trenches now, but only because the Russians pushed through all the open areas like Kopjeve, Shevchenko Persheh, areas north of Mirny, Malanivka, areas that completely lacked the necessary amount of trenches. You can see that over here. These are the only defenses built that were easily bypassed and weren't really manned. So you do have a compensation based on the fact that a lot of other units have come in recently, been deployed to this region. 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade is an example. You have the 117th Heavy Mechanized Brigade as well. 80th Air Assault Brigade, or 82nd rather, redeployed from the Sumy region. And over here you have the 1st Assault Regiment, Da Vinci's Wolves, pretty good unit, although it's small in size. 14th National Guard Brigade, they're a mainstay of this location. So there was an argument to be had that perhaps there has to be another unit to sort of ensure that the Russians aren't able to achieve a breakthrough in Razina or push through and really assert themselves within villages like Novoekonomishny or Mykolaievka. So perhaps there will be additional redeployments, but we've seen that the Ukrainians are already undertaking redeployments to this region because they understand the urgency of preventing deeper Russian infiltrations. So that's it for that part of the front line. Nothing occurred over the past 2 days of notes on the ground. I do think there were a couple of updates from Kharkiv that will be interesting to you guys. So let's begin with Zaporizhzhia. So the Russian forces, they were able to, or rather the Ukrainians, they were able to push back the Russians and take back the entirety of the village of Zaporizhzhia, including also the northern chunks of Bohuslavka that were threatened due to Russian advances that occurred during March. And so at that point, the Ukrainians were able to stabilize the situation, and you could see that the units involved include the 4th Tank Brigade. They're one of the mainstays of this part of the front line. So I believe they may have been involved in the offensive activities as well, but I didn't see which unit did it. This video over here from the Fever UAV unit, it shows grenade drops onto houses that included Ukrainian soldiers in them. Based on that geolocation, we know that the Ukrainian forces advanced along the R79 highway and were able to assert control over a large majority of the village. You could argue that this sort of gray zone in between Kruchliakivka and Zaporizhzhia is sort of like ambiguous, and it might still be considered within the state boundaries of Zaporizhzhia. So maybe it's not fully captured. But either way, this is really important because it denies the Russians an opportunity to really build up a solid advance, a solid salient, and actually expand it past that point. Because had the Russians succeeded in permanently taking control over this chunk of territory, they then would have been able to shift their focus eastwards and solidify the front line, turn it into something that's far more manageable to hold on to, and then from there build up a solid base to begin attacking southwards towards other villages running along the Oskil River, and to actually infiltrate towards the trench line built by the Ukrainians. They have 2 layers of trenches, so a permanent capture of this 8.4 square kilometer chunk of territory would really allow them to overrun that first line, the first one out of two, towards Borova, which is one of the most important towns on the eastern bank of the Oskil River. So this is a completely understandable and justifiable use of Ukraine's counterattacking capabilities. And for the time being, it will give them time to build up in lieu of further Russian attacks, because I don't believe this is the end of it. I do think there will be positional back and forth. But more generally, the issues over here won't end because the Russian forces do still have control over this a really strong salient branching out of Pischane, which we talked about so much last year and its significance. And now we're seeing how it's really manifested. I believe this is also a recent advance. It's just to the east of Sepovo Novosilka. You can see that it amounts to 10.5 square kilometers. It's just a broad advance along open fields as the Russians tried entering into the village of Stepova, but were unable to. And this is from June 30th. It's a video from the 43rd Brigade. They just conducted FPV strikes onto armored vehicles and destroyed some of them that were being utilized by the Russian side. And in terms of armor, there are actually a lot of armored formations, tank units that are attached to this part of the front line, despite the fact that it isn't that critical of an area for the Russians when you look at the three main sectors. Also, around Sinkivka, the Russian forces were able to advance 2.5 square kilometers. It was reported by Deep State themselves. So this advance does allow the Russians to get ever so close to the ditch over here. This includes a body of water, a local pond. There are also some trenches that I'm sure are not shown on the map over here that were built by the Ukrainians. And there would also be several layers of ditches that sort of the Ukrainians took advantage of before arriving at Petropavlovka itself. So for now, I believe it's just a positional advance, not anything more than that. And to move on to an interesting advance that occurred, we had over here this small village captured. And I did warn about this when the Russians entered into Stroivka. You can see it over here. Now the Russians are beginning to redeploy certain companies. I would refer to them as companies from the Northern Group of Forces, which is this large grouping that was formed at the beginning of 2024, was involved in the Vovchansk offensive, and then got redeployed largely to deal with the Kursk offensive, in addition to the air assault units and the naval infantry units over there. So now it's beginning to send in small detachments to conduct these DRG raids and then actual permanent occupation of villages near the border. So now we're seeing it occur in an area that is completely disconnected from other parts of the front line. And you can see that with Milove. So the Russian forces were able to cross over and raise their flag atop the administrative building, and this was done by the 83rd Motorized Rifle Regiment. It's a part of the 69th Division, and it received air support from the 72nd Motorized Rifle Division of the 44th Army Corps. So they raised their flag over here. That geolocation does show us that they were able to enter into the village, but we don't know about the rest of the populated areas because it is a rather sort of long village, but it's only one road that's of particular importance, and it sort of spans just really long, winding routes. So there's still a large chunk of the village which may be under Ukrainian control, or at the very least not in Russian hands. But for at least now, they've been able to take a stab at it, I would say, and get a foothold. So here you can see the 83rd Regiment, and beforehand they were deployed on the eastern flank of the Kursk front. So now they're being redeployed to here. At least a certain element is. And I remember saying when the Russians entered into Stroivka that a good barometer for whether this is a part of a broader, I believe, plan of action to undermine the border region and open up new parts of the front line. Obviously, not doing so in one fell swoop, not doing so in any sort of immediate way, but just sort of laying the framework for it, laying the groundwork, would be to check whether these infiltrations don't just occur near the Oskil River, where it could be seemingly connected to the operations over there, but if it also occurs just smack in the middle of nowhere, areas that were not really important to either side throughout the entirety of these 3 years. And now we're beginning to see that. This is the first example of such a case. So we'll keep an eye out to see whether that continues to develop and whether there are additional DRG raids. I'll certainly be reporting on it. And now to finish off, I did rework and really shuffle around the deployment map over here because I hadn't done so for a while, and there are a lot of changes to the units that are actually involved in defending Sumy. So first of all, to Kino, we know that the main units involved include the 103rd TDF Brigade, the Scala Assault Regiment. They are extremely important, including their second, I believe, Special Operations or whatever it's called, battalion. It's actually called the Second Assault Company. Sorry. So the Second Assault Company, they are involved in a lot of the day-to-day fighting operations, actual engagements within Russian soil in Tedkino. So for the time being, they are doing much of that dirty work. They also have the 158th Mechanized Brigade and the Array Battalion of the 129th TDF Brigade. So that's the main Ukrainian garrison over there. You also have involvement from, I believe this is the 33rd Assault Regiment, previously deployed to Belgorod, but that attack fizzled out, and now they're fighting in another area where they're trying to advance, and that would be Tetkino. You have the two vectors of Russian attacks that have, materialized, and we can all see now. One of them coming towards Andrivka, where we saw Ukrainian localized counterattacks, and the other one is larger in scope and is focused on Yunikivka, where the Ukrainians have currently stabilized the front line, and they don't really have a choice but to do so. So I'll get into that in a moment. But zooming in over here, we can see that the 80th or 79th, actually, Air Assault Brigade, they are now deployed to this region. And, just a couple of weeks ago, they were fighting and engaged in heavy clashes along the southern Donetsk front in areas like Andrivka and Bakhtir. And then they were part of the Russian breakthroughs and tried to repel them as they crossed the border into Dnipro. But it appears that there was a shift, and that for the most part, the Ukrainian side wants to ensure that the air assault units are deployed to two sectors. So in that way, they could just work in tandem. They can't really be dispersed across multiple fronts. They should be, according to the Ukrainian perspective, deployed to two different areas. So one would be, I suppose, the Sumy front line, and this is the area where we see the most involvement of the air assault units. And remember, there are two army corps that are including that feed the air assault structure, basically. So they don't all have to be together. Half of them have to be deployed to one sector, and half of them have to be deployed to another, in order for the Army Corps system to actually serve its proper function. So now we have the 79th over here, and it's accompanied by the 95th Brigade and by the, 80th Air Assault Brigade, and also by the 78th Hertz Air Assault Regiment, which has been redeployed from the Kharkiv front. So that's another addition. You also have the Ranger units, a lot of these regiments that are a part of the Ranger force that was created in the summer of 2024. So 6th Regiment, 4th Regiment, 8th Regiment, all of them deployed to this region. 71st Jaeger Brigade redeployed from the southern Donetsk front to defend over here. They're an important unit. And a lot of this has been done in order to fill the backlog caused by the redeployment of the Marine brigades, because the Marine units were involved in defending and also in localized counterattacks. But they, for the most part, been redeployed, the four of them, to the Donetsk front, including to the areas northeast of Pokrovsk, and others to the areas that are on the border with Dnipro. Either way, that sort of loss, that void, is being filled by other units of rather high caliber, like the air assault forces, and there are also some mechanized units. But we are also seeing that a lot of the defense is being done by territorial defense units, but more so in the lower intensity parts of this front line. So you have more TDF units deployed to the eastern section of the Sumy border, and then by the Belgrade border, you already receive the more elite units, because they're still deployed generally to that region. I believe they're deployed there at this point in order to tie down Russian forces, in order to prevent them from being redeployed elsewhere. But at some point, the Belgrade incursion and all of the back and forth on the forested border is going to end. And then you're going to see the 47th Brigade, for instance, or the 22nd Brigade, or the 225th Battalion, Assault Battalion, redeployed, because right now I believe that their function and the potential could be much higher than what it's currently at. But what I'm saying is that this part of the front line does include more TDF units, and the area that's more active to the west does feed in more of the higher caliber units, which does make a lot of sense, because the Russians are advancing along these two axes over here. And to Ukraine's credit, they were able to turn the tide. And now there's a question of how long that will last, but for sure, the Russian forces were able to achieve their preliminary objectives of overrunning the border regions and overrunning the next line of villages. And from there, the objective was to push forward across 5 kilometers of open fields and arrive at this temporary line that sort of spans from Krovny all the way to Marini over here. So this line includes a lot of important villages, some of them large in size, some of them are hamlets. They're all connected by local roads, and a lot of them are well defended through forested areas. But this serves as a natural Ukrainian fallback line, and losing this fallback line would then give the Russians the opportunity to take advantage of all the roads and actually conduct really deep penetrations into Sumy Oblast through areas that are not that well defended, and begin getting very close to the city itself. So that's the fear, and that's why the Ukrainians have been able to really get their minds set on this particular part of the front line, redeploy forces, and also involve themselves in counterattacks, which is something that they refrained from doing in Sumy for a while as the Russians continued advancing. But now, due to Russian exhaustion, I believe, from nonstop advances since the end of the Kursk operation and the entrance to Sumy, due to them being stretched out to a certain degree, which could cause issues logistically, due to the Ukrainians having a strong garrison, which they absolutely do. They do have a lot of high quality units over here. that have displayed in the past the potential for these sort of counterattacks. It makes complete sense that they would be able to sense that the opportunity for really reversing the situation was closing, that their window for stabilization was closing. And so they had to sort of kick things off on their own accord and conduct offensive activity in order to cause that sort of friction that stabilizes the line and prevents further Russian momentum deeper into their territory. So that's what we've seen over here. And now the question will be, how long can they actually ensure that the fighting gets relegated to Andrivka in order to prevent the Russians from then refocusing their efforts on pushing southwards towards the line of villages that we talked about. So that's the current situation over there. And the same thing goes for Yunikivka. We haven't really seen many active counterattacks, but we are seeing them, the Ukrainians over here, engaged in intense defending. And obviously, this could change very quickly, but for the time being, they are trying to drag out the fighting. Yunikivka is a relatively large village, and losing it would give the Russians access to open fields all the way to the national park, to the forested regions, and from there they would actually have coverage to push southwards towards a lot of other villages that, yet again, are not that well connected. They're not part of a unified defense line, which hasn't been built here in Sumy Oblast, which is a huge issue. And from there, Sumy itself gets under danger once the ridges that overlook it are captured. So that's a part of the bigger picture when it comes to Sumy. And I just want to finish off by looking at the decision by the Undersecretary for Defense Policy, Elbridge Colby, to pause the shipments to Ukraine. Not all of them, but certain shipments will go through the actual systems. And this is what's being reported, that it was an initiative led by Colby, but I'm sure that there was also support from other elements in the State Department, for instance. Some of them don't like it. For instance, a lot of the people in the National Security Council may not have approved of it. But all in all, I believe this is a part of the United States trying to reevaluate its munition stockpiles to ensure that they're not getting completely burned out, being sent to Ukraine, being utilized against Russia. And so there's a fear within the United States, especially with the Trump administration now and the people that have in the Defense Department, like Elbridge Colby, Sean Parnell, and in the DNI, it's Tulsi Gabbard. Those sort of people, that milieu, which they consider themselves to be America first, looking at their stockpiles and considering whether they are running low, especially after the war between Israel and Iran, where you did see a lot of THAADs being burnt through, and also a lot of Patriot PAC-3s being burnt through, whether it being Qatar when those were utilized or actually being fired in Saudi Arabia or Israel to intercept Iranian ballistic missiles. So that just gave the Department of Defense further impetus to rethink its allocation and procurement of munitions. And so now they're doing a complete reassessment. And so within that sort of situation, they felt the need to pause the shipments of certain systems to Ukraine so those can be examined, and they have to check whether there are actually enough of those available in order to give to Ukraine. So we're looking at, based on the reporting, that PAC-3 interceptors will be paused. The shipments of those will be paused, including as well the shipments of the rockets used for GMLRS. So that's very important for Ukrainian deep precision strikes. Same thing with 155 millimeter artillery shells. I think that's the biggest deal of all, in addition to the PAC-3s, obviously, because Ukraine is really pushing for more interceptors for Patriots PAC-2s, but also especially PAC-3s. So Zelensky himself, actually, he was pushing for a $15 billion purchase of 10 Patriot systems for the United States. That's his current goal, and he's trying to get Europe to court Trump to allow this to happen. So, in addition to 155 millimeter artillery shells, which is huge because the Ukrainians need that on a daily basis, that's one of their most important needs. And by the way, the Ukrainian artillery situation right now is not dire, by the way. They have a good amount. The ratio between the Russians and the Ukrainians has been closing recently. And so there's not a major artillery shortage. There was last year, before the bill passed in April of 2024 during the Biden administration. And then they got a huge replenishment. But right now, artillery is not Ukraine's main issue, but it could become an issue in the future if the shipments from America stop. So that's another thing to mention. But, Stinger man pads, those will also be halted for the time being. The AIM-7 air-to-air missiles, those are also being halted for the time being. And AIM-7s, they have their uses, whether it be in air-to-air combat or air defense missions, if they're sort of because they have the naval counterpart, the Rim. So the Ukrainians have reconfigured those and put them onto Buk systems as air defense. So that's a creative way of using them as well that can be used now in the future. And finally, Hellfire missiles. So those are, I believe, air to surface missiles or precision, and they're also called the AGM 114. They're used a lot in Ukrainian NATO jets to target Russian hardened targets like trench bunkers, sometimes air defense assets as well. A lot of dug in locations, basements, for instance. So it does have an important use. But all in all, the PAC 3 interceptors, which Zelensky wants, and the artillery, that's the most important. And it's not everything, because there are also other types of shells that will continue coming in. There are spare parts that will continue coming in. But a lot of these systems are already in Poland, because there's this conveyor belt from Ramstein in Germany. That's where they land. And then from there, they pass through into Poland and go through the highway or the rail lines into Ukraine itself. So some of that will be paused, not all of it, and I believe it's going to be temporary while the United States tries to reassess how much it actually has of certain systems. And the United States is definitely wrapping up production now. The big beautiful bill has passed, and it's going to give even more funding on an annual basis to the Department of Defense. So they're definitely going to be increasing the amount of contracts for a lot of these productions. Raytheon's going to get a hell of a lot of contracts for this production. And that means that by 2027, I believe that's like a good year to sort of anchor this point. The United States will be able to produce en masse a lot of these systems. They will be able to reach like 100,000 per month in 155 millimeter shells, for instance. They're going to be able to produce a lot of interceptors for Patriots, but it takes time, and that's all on paper for now. At this point in time, right now, they don't have that sort of abundance that they need. And the United States is obviously going to look at its own priorities, especially with this administration. But I'm personally of the opinion that after Putin's reiteration that he's still looking to fulfill his objectives, he said that he's open to negotiations, but that he's still honing in on his key objectives. That's what he told Trump. That Trump's going to eventually let the aid to Ukraine resume. The United States still has nearly $4 billion that's unused from the $61 billion that was passed last year in presidential drawdown authority. Biden left it open for Trump to utilize, and it gives him an opportunity to get actual new shipments in addition to what's already being shipped, because you already have contracts, outstanding contracts from defense contractors that have to give aid to Ukraine. And there's also the through the State Department, there's another mechanism for aiding Ukraine, but I believe that it doesn't have any more money in its budget, and the Congress is not going to pass any bills to fund Ukraine unless Trump asks for it directly, and he hasn't done so. He hasn't even shown any indication of doing so. So for now, the best bet for Ukraine would be the resumption of the contracts and also the resumption of the presidential drawdown authority funding, which could happen eventually, depending on the sort of deadlock and negotiations. I think it probably will happen at some point. And also tomorrow, there's going to be a phone call between Trump and Zelensky. And in that phone call, Zelensky is going to try to get the Patriots purchase done. He's also going to try to request that Ukraine can still receive American weapons through European purchases. So European countries in NATO will purchase the weapons from the United States, and then they will give them to Ukraine. So it will be through a third party. But that idea is sort of counterintuitive to the entire point of why Colby paused the shipments in the first place, which was not really a political consideration. It was more so a practical consideration about the stockpiles. That's what he's been sort of signaling out of this, and that's what seems the most logical. So I don't know if that would really be like really a solution, because for now I believe there's still going to be an assessment of the situation by the Defense Department. But I do believe that at some point Trump will agree to that. Maybe he will even agree to that tomorrow, and he will let the Europeans sell weapons that they receive from America and give them to Ukraine for free. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.